stragglers come in due to the early start, but I'm conscious that we've only got our brilliant panel for now, so I want to make sure we make the most of that time. Thank you all for joining us, bright and breezy, for this event. An incredibly timely discussion, I think, on a vital question, how we can turn crisis into renewal for community assets and networks. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Will Tanner. I am the director of Onward, and if you don't know Onward, we are a relatively new centre-right think tank focusing on levelling up opportunity and strengthening community in every part of the UK, and particularly in those places where opportunity and community have been in decline. There is no doubt, I think, that the last 2 years have been a time of crisis for many communities. We've all seen local businesses struggle, we've seen charities overloaded with demand, we've seen the social infrastructure of places stretched to its limits, after decades in which, frankly, those local assets and networks had also been in decline for some time. But I think the pandemic has also shown just how valuable and important those assets and networks are. In our work at Onward, we found that during lockdown, people were more concerned about the jobs and incomes of the wider community than the jobs and incomes of their own family or themselves. We found that people were overwhelmingly supportive of action from government to intervene to safeguard locally important assets and networks and to retain some of that sense of belonging, which is coming back into our politics, I think, in a really big way. So the challenge for policymakers, including some of those on the panel today, is how to find ways to help retain those civic assets, how to ensure that they not only recover from the last few years, but also thrive, and also see how those assets, those networks, whether it's post offices, village shops, local businesses, convenience stores, take on new roles within communities and adapt to some of those changing trends, whether that's changing nature of retail or indeed post-pandemic work pattern environment. So I am delighted to get into those questions. We have a formidable panel of speakers here today. I'm not going to labour the point on their introductions because they are people whose backgrounds kind of speak for themselves. But first we're going to hear from Neil O'Brien. Neil is someone I've worked with for many years, and he co-founded Onward with me and others, and he is the new Parliamentary Under Secretary of State at the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, and the person who has been charged with driving forward the Prime Minister's work on levelling up the White Paper. We will then hear from Joe Gideon, MP, who's the MP for Stoke-on-Trent Central, also a member of Onward's Levelling Up Task Force, someone we've worked with very closely on the levelling up agenda over the last few years. Third, we're going to hear from Nick Reed, who's Group Chief Executive of the Post Office, and I'm incredibly grateful to the Post Office for supporting this event and allowing us to have this conversation at such an important time. We are then subject to him arriving on time. We're going to hear from Danny Kruger, who did warn us that he was coming straight from another event, so he will be arriving soon. Some people are suckers for culture. So Danny, he'll be known to many of you as one of centre-right's most thoughtful individuals on community, belonging, place. He authored a review for the Prime Minister called Levelling Up Communities last year, and is now PPS at the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, so someone deeply involved in these issues. And then finally we're going to hear from Martin McTague, who's National Vice Chair for Policy and Advocacy at the Federation of Small Businesses, so someone who is looking at this question specifically from the point of view of SMEs. We only have an hour, so I am going to now stop talking, and I'm going to hand over to our esteemed panel. They're going to speak for 5 minutes only, if that's all right, panel, and then we will have hopefully lots of time for Q&A from the audience. And I should say, if people want to get up and have coffee, grab some breakfast during the proceedings, please do. It's there for your benefit, and it will go to waste if you don't use it. So, without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Neil.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all of you. There's an amazing number of people here for this time in the morning. Yeah, you are the true highlight of this conference. One of the great highlights of a reshuffle, as many of you will know, is the situation where you find that one minister has written to another And by the time the reshuffle is over, they find that they are the ministers to whom they have written. And they have to reply to them. We're not quite in the same situation, though. We're now in a situation where Daniels and PPS, we have to reply to the Kruger review. And so in this like always position, we should have a meeting with ourselves to talk. Anyway, we've truly disappeared into some sort of up ourselves in some way. But I'm going to be quite brief because all the other people on the panel know much more about this than I do, not least Will, who's been really driving forward the whole agenda around community, the sense of belonging, all the kind of agenda that really became quite interesting and on focus after a lot of people who wrote Button's book Bowling Alone in the 90s, so people suddenly start to put metrics on the decline of community in that sense that some of our social fabric is rather frayed. So over the last year, the last 18 months, obviously we've been through an incredibly difficult period as a country, and one of the few silver linings with a few highlights and all that has been the sort of civic surge that we've had, really, the huge growth of volunteering, the incredible number of community groups forming themselves up. You can see running from Harbour here, even though all the different Facebook groups and people looking after each other and all charities stepping forward in a difficult situation, that has been one of the highlights. And the question that strong in my mind is how we keep all that going. So we had our local volunteers fair the other day for the first time in 2 years. It was really nice to find all these charities able to get out in the street, recruit people again, show off their wares. But part of it is about the kind of the social infrastructure. Part of it is about the kind of community facilities that those things anchor themselves around. Because of course, you need places to meet. You need places for people to meet each other. And those have also been declined. Onward in their reports on politics of belonging, having terrifying statistics on the decline in the number of post offices, the number of pubs, the number of community facilities, libraries and so on, and all these things that are the anchor points for our social life over a very long period, 20, 30 years. So we have that as a challenge, and then we also have the challenge of the kind of online retail world, which is really changing our high streets. We've gone from, in 2018, we had about 1 in every 25 pounds was spent online. It's now, just a couple of years later, 1 in 3. And that's had a huge effect on our high streets, which suddenly went from about 6 to about 17% vacancies in the Great Recession, and never really came down from that. A lot of them still struggling. So we have a stretched social infrastructure, a lot of community facilities either lacking or challenged, and we have this great challenge on our high streets. What are we going to do about it? Well, as part of the Levelling Up agenda is one of the 4 key sort of pillars of it. It's about empowerment of local leaders and communities, the first thing. It's about getting the private sector growing more strongly, improving living standards where they're weaker. The third thing is about spreading opportunity and improving our public services where they're weaker. And the fourth and final thing is about really restoring local pride, and that is about regeneration. It's about community life, because it would be easy for us to have the best regional policies in the world, do lots of economy, and get the economy moving in places where it's been struggling, but then not really be connecting with the things that, when people say, I feel like my town is run down, I feel like this town's got a problem, that they mean something else, that they mean that the market is shut, doesn't open anymore, that they mean that the sense of community is gone out of the place. So it's very important to have that fourth pillar to pick up that sort of concern, because we know from Onward's research and others that actually there is some quite high energy politics to all this. In the places where the sense of community is most frayed, you had the biggest vote to leave in the European referendum. The same thing is true in France as well. The Gilets jaunes are strongest, weirdly, in places that lost their shop, which is a big thing in France. You've got some community life, you go and back in. And so there's a link between the fraying of community life and political discontent that we ignore on parallel. So these are the challenges. What can we do about it? Well, in the pandemic, we started to liberalise the way we use our high streets, and for the first time you could just go and put tables on the pavement and have your cafe outside. And Market Harbour suddenly has this sort of community, cafe society of the kind of Tony Crossland. Not how he wanted it to come about, but we finally got that sort of continental thing going on. And we are keeping those freedoms, and we're also thinking about how we can extend those freedoms as well. How do you the community right to challenge, the community right to take over empty shops and to use those things in a more creative way. So there's a bit of it that I think is about kind of regenerations and freedoms, and I think a bit of it is also about, and I'm interested in views of panelists, how we use heritage assets and other community facilities more. How do we get more out of them? Because there's still got a lot of community facilities in a country that are pretty underused and get used a couple of times a week. There's still a lot of heritage buildings that mean things to people we're kind of underusing, and there's bits of some inspirational things around the country from Broadband to Coventry where people have taken these assets that are, you know, iconic buildings in the community and made them proper community hubs. So there's lots of things to discuss in this session. I'm mainly here to listen, to be honest with you, but I do think it's a tremendously important agenda. Is you know, it's easy for us to talk as politicians about 2% extra GDP and we're going to give you 50,000 extra nurses and all these things. But there is something that is very close to people's hearts about the sense of heart in a place, that sense of community. Although that's sometimes seen as a kind of soft politics, it's a part of politics it's incredibly important to people. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion, looking forward to taking notes. With that, I will hand over.
Neil, thank you very much, and it's really fantastic to have a minister here so early in their brief, not just to kind of hear directionally where you're thinking, but also to have the opportunity to kind of surface some of these questions to you, and I hope that people in the audience will have good questions and points to raise for Neil in the coming session. So, without further ado, I'm now going to hand over to Jo Gideon. Jo.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I think Onward, the Levelling Up Task Force was the first thing I joined when I became a Member of Parliament, and for me, representing a red wall seat, I'm the first Conservative MP that has ever been in Stoke-on-Trent Central. Levelling up is the key issue, so it's a pleasure to be here. So during the last 18 months, we've become acutely aware of both the importance and the power of community. In every part of the UK, we came together during the pandemic through a vast network of volunteers. In Stoke-on-Trent Central, people have got a really strong sense of identity with the city, but for Stokies, which is what they called and what I hope to be, an adopted Stokey quite soon, the connection's often to neighbourhoods rather than to the city as a whole, and it's quite complex because it's a city of 6 towns. It's called a multi-centric linear city, which is quite a mouthful at 8 o'clock in the morning, but it's a nightmare for town planners, and there's a legacy of public transport which has got to be solved if we're to level up. And the interesting thing is that the community identifies, as I say, with the part rather than the whole to a certain extent, but in order to level up, we have to repurpose and redesign lots of the city, but we need to take people with us, and I think that's the key. So Hanley is the city centre, is the economic city centre, but other towns within the city go, well, why does the money go there rather than it came here? So to a certain extent, the lack of public transport and connectivity is an issue, is the issue, and that will help this. But it's also, I think, winning over hearts and minds. Instead, there's a stoicism about the city's decline. The pits and the steelworks have gone, and the ceramics industry is far smaller now than in its heyday. We've got many old factory buildings, and mentioned these heritage buildings that are just falling into decline. And we need to repurpose these, we actually need. So my passion is the Spoda Works in Stoke, which potentially could be a national centre for ceramics. It could form a community focus, second to none in the city because it's anchored in the heritage. But in order to do that, we need a huge amount of investment. And I think it's enormously important to revive something like that because it was a community asset in the sense, as I say, the kind of the bottom-up approach rather than the top-down approach is really, really important for neighbourhoods. And it has to involve social enterprises, businesses, third sector organisations, all of whom are really active in places like Stoke-on-Trent. They have the vision, they just need to be empowered to deliver it. Investment in physical infrastructure is essential, and we've seen a lot of kind of shovel-ready projects coming forward, which is important as well. But investment in local skills, health and children's services are vital for generating civic pride, and comparable productivity, I think, is the same in social infrastructure as physical infrastructure. Cuts to vital community services such as libraries and parks reduce civic action and reduce engagement. And I think that investment in these community assets is critical for fostering pride and hope in localities. And local post offices are a prime example of a vital community asset. They contribute enormously to community life as a vehicle for delivering public services that both the public and businesses need. And so I think it's essential that government supports the post office network, that we have access to local branches. But I do also recognise that in order to be cost effective, local branches may be at your bargain booths rather than a kind of sub-post office in the traditional sense. And therefore, there'll be areas where the post office won't offer its full range of services, but it's just really important to have that. I'm really pleased that Burslem in Stoke-on-Trent North is a pilot for a national scheme to improve access to cash, because community leaders and local businesses are working with the banking industry to find ways of making cash viable. This is a really innovative scheme that allows customers to use an app which shows where shops have cash and where they can access cash without having to buy something. So, for people who really can't afford to do more than get their £12.50 out and don't want to buy something, this is a really important scheme. Reviving community assets is massively important across the country. This isn't so when we link it into levelling up, it's not a North South or a London versus the rest argument, because we know that rural communities, for instance, are often isolated, and when their community assets go, the last bank closing in a village or the village shop or anything, that this has a devastating impact on communities. So I really do think that in order to make people and communities feel empowered, we've got to prioritise investment in local social infrastructure, and we've got to level up equally. For those places that are farther behind, equally looks different in terms of cash help. But if we revive our community assets and networks, we're going to ensure greater, longer-term economic prosperity for us all.
Joe, thank you very much. That was brilliant. And I think your final point, that point about long-termism and kind of thinking about how we can retain some of this essential infrastructure over the long term is vital. Fantastic. I'm going to now hand over to Nick to give some remarks from the presentation.
Thank you very much, Will. Good morning, everybody. I thought I'd just start actually by commenting on a couple of things that many of the panelists said. I think Will started by saying this is about locally important assets and how we retain, recover and thrive. And there was also a comment about closing post offices. And I think what I would say, certainly having taken over running the post offices 2 years ago, is that it's been an extraordinary 18 months. A time, I think, where the post offices could demonstrate the genuine value, both economically, but probably more importantly, socially, within communities. Over the last 18 months, we've heard endless stories about how post offices have stayed open when banks have closed, how individuals have gone the extra mile in terms of delivering to the isolated, to the vulnerable, to the people who are socially excluded, and made most extraordinary social interventions in communities that are very, very difficult to actually describe and articulate in an economic way. And one of the challenges coming into this job that everybody said to me was, well, the post office is utterly critical to our communities, both from an economic perspective and from a social perspective. And trying to put some kind of wrapper around what does social mean was extremely difficult, really until the last 18 months, where I think the post office, probably more than any other institution, has performed a bizarre and extraordinary role right the way across the country. We have some 11,500 post offices in the nation as a whole, and have had done for the last 10 years. So there's a very interesting narrative that says post offices are closing, post offices are closing. It really isn't the case, actually. We've literally been 11,500 since 2012. What's also quite interesting is that this time last year, yes, 1,400 closed in the first pandemic, and we spent an enormous amount of time trying to get them open, because we knew that we were servicing 11 million customers on a weekly basis right the way across the country. But I had some 750 postmasters who were over 70. They wanted to shield, they needed to shield. And actually we had to find ways to keep communities alive and keep communities open. And so we spent a lot of time looking at how we could find relief for our post offices and our postmasters. So while the banks reduced their hours from 10 until 2 in most cases, or indeed closed, I think many people will recognise that last year was the largest number of bank closures that there has been since 2012. So we stayed open, and actually 97% of post offices stayed open right the way through the pandemic, providing extraordinary services across the piece. On the other side, on the economic side, one of the really interesting issues that we've observed, certainly over the last 18 months, has been the growth in marketplace sellers and individual businesses that have flourished locally. Why so? I think the introduction of furlough, an extraordinarily brave initiative, I may hasten to add, has basically spurned or grown a number of different businesses and a number of different opportunities for marketplace sellers, for internet sellers, for individual businesses across the country. And what we've seen, certainly from the post offices, if you've got internet access and you've got a post office, you can do business. And we've seen an extraordinary growth from small businesses who have been able to access cash from the post offices, do their essential banking, and more importantly, send and move parcels around the country. And I was talking to somebody on Friday actually who runs a honey business, set it up during the pandemic, a small business distributing medicinal honey around the country. And she said to me, Nick, without the ability to deposit money into your post offices, or more importantly, when a friend of mine drives past my house at 4 o'clock, picks up my bags of parcels, pops into the post office, drops the bag off, and the postmaster then sorts out all the parcels, puts all the pricing on, sends them off, 99% of them are delivered the next day. She said my business wouldn't survive. And I think I may mention this later, but we then went out and spoke to small businesses, and they said 8 out of 10 of them said we wouldn't have been able to operate during the pandemic if it hadn't been for the post office. We wouldn't have been able to thrive. And I think what we're seeing now is that this sort of growth in localism rather than everything happening in an urban area is just absolutely fascinating. And as I say, we've got 11,500 across the country. And in those areas, in those rural areas, in those small communities, we have a disproportionate number of post offices. I think every constituency has between 17 and 25 post offices. Every postcode has a post office. And every postcode, therefore, has the opportunity to sort of build and grow a community. And we're finding this extraordinary growth in small businesses as being not completely, but to a large extent, funded and pushed by the post office, which has been a very positive outcome. And so I guess my sort of observation in terms of stopping my aim before I hand over is just to sort of say a thank you really to the postmasters across the country, the likes of the postal team who looked after Colonel Tom's cards, right the way through to those that delivered pensions and those that delivered universal credit and money to individuals on an individual basis across rural communities. Absolutely extraordinary. So certainly from my perspective, the growth in the internet, the growth in localism, and the ability of the post office to provide everyday services, I think it's got a huge role to play in the levelling up agenda.
Thank you, Nick. That's enormously positive and exceptional contribution, and it really does kind of make the link, I think, between the work that your sub-postmasters do and their communities, which those communities rely on those assets. Martin, I'm going to come to you now. Danny has a short invite text message that he's 2 minutes away, so we will be joined by Danny very shortly. But Martin, could you speak first?
Yeah, I'm a Danny son. I'll do my best.
There are worse people to stand in for.
I know. I think most of the people in this room will know that small business community is not just an economic entity. They are the glue in many communities. They hold things together. The one story that stood out in my mind from the pandemic was an IT consultant in Northumbria who was telling me that he spent at least half his time advising people over 70 how they should contact their grandchildren using Zoom and Teams. And he's not doing that because it's a money-making operation. He's doing that because it's part of his values, it's part of what he believes in. And there's business owners, small business owners, don't need a CSR policy to tell them what they should do and shouldn't do. They are naturally inclined to help in their communities. And many of the communities that really depend on them are the ones that we've been talking about before, in the left behind or levelling up areas, where you've got deprived communities, rural communities, and it's easy to forget that in the last recession, 90% of the new jobs that were created after the recession were created by SMEs. So in terms of recovery from something like the shock of the pandemic, SMEs will be vital to do that. And then when you contrast that with the reaction of some of our big corporates, it's very disappointing. I mean, I'm going to single out the banks for a bit of criticism. The 08-09, I think a lot of people came out of that crisis feeling that the banks had severely let the community down, and they had a lot of ground to make up. We have found that although they're performing better, and their performance during this crisis was good when it came to things like bounce back loans, they're still very tin-eared when it comes to branch closures. They believe they can make what is just fundamentally a straightforward commercial decision without any implications for their reputation. And in many cases, that means that if I'm forced to drive 20 miles to deposit my cash, okay, I might sort of grumble about it, but internally I'm thinking, I hate this organisation, and if there's any way in which I can find to get away from it, I will. And that is happening in many situations. And so it was really nice to be asked to be on this Access to Cash pilot group, where we experimented with some of the innovative alternatives. And what it showed is that in the end, although most small businesses are really sort of indifferent to the way in which people pay for their services, they can pay digitally or they can pay with cash, they know the importance of keeping that tension between cash and digital. If digital becomes completely dominant, then they know that the costs will start to increase. So they want the option to be there. And the other thing that came out clearly was they need a safe and secure and private place to deposit. Now I know what Joe said, it's nice to have, you know, your bargain booze open with a post office at the back. But frankly, if I've got $5 grand in a bag, I don't really want to be at the back of bargain booze putting my money in. And it then becomes who can I trust? What brand can I trust? And I've got to say, and I know it's not because you're the sponsor, the standout solution was the post office hub. And it provided everything the SMEs were asking for. So it seems to me that when we go to the next stage of this process, we've got to think about those kind of issues, the issues that will secure a community, protect a community. It seems that when you widen that out to the sort of the levelling up agenda more broadly, a lot of the left behind communities, those are in rural areas, small towns, where business density is really quite low. Now that means they become a lot more dependent on support because they don't have accountants, they don't have solicitors, they don't have a local university that they can refer to. So they need more business support. So when it comes to people skills, I think those communities will be much more dependent on business support. When it comes to infrastructure, the clear thing for me is, and this comes back over and over again from the people we speak to, is they need better broadband. They need better mobile coverage. And bizarrely, they need better buses. Because a lot of the time, if they're going to get their workforce to where they're based, and these communities are spread out, the only viable alternatives are us. So I'll finish it there. Thank you very much.
Martin, thank you so much. And you touched on something in those remarks that I think is vitally important, which often gets overlooked in these discussions, which is that trust is vital in an modern economy, and that isn't some kind of fluffy, kind of softer politics thing to say. That's something that people like Ken Arrow and Andy Haldane and others have been banging on about for decades. There are large parts of the economy that rely almost entirely on trust, actually. So having trusted assets to support businesses, especially in kind of left areas, is really, really vital. Danny, thank you so much for joining us. And it's really fantastic to have you on the panel. Can I come to you? You've missed a couple of remarks, but I hope, I have, and I'm sure Neil and you share in the same department. Neil probably said a few things that you may cover, but I'm very keen to hear what your thoughts are, and particularly kind of drawing on your review for the PM last year.
Thanks, and many apologies for being late. The previous thing overran. And I thought
We were all very impressed that you were at an event.
Yeah, yes, it was actually online. It was online, so that's where it was. And then I tried to get into the secure area, brilliantly, which this isn't in. So we've been in and out of security already. So regret missing the discussion, guys. My apologies. So my starting point is that having done most of my work before politics, or alongside politics, in London, and thinking a lot about civil society and the social fabric and the places of belonging that give people meaning and connection and agency and opportunity. Coming to rural Wiltshire, as I did as the MP in 2019, and discovered how much the same issues apply, and thinking, I was going to be coming into a place rather, perhaps very wrongly, that was, in a sense, in the old economy. Obviously, it's a farming community primarily, but in fact, you have in Wiltshire the seeds of the economy of the future, all sorts of really innovative and interesting tech-based manufacturing and service companies that are potentially really going to benefit from global Britain, from our trade opportunities, and from what we hope will be the which Ray brands it, high skill, high wage economy that we are creating. Is that right? And the other thing that I've realised, worrying a bit, as I grew up in a little village in the Cotswolds, think that's genuinely been left behind really, except for the rich weekenders. How are we going to keep these villages? How are these villages going to be viable? But what we discover, and to Martin's point about broadband and connectivity, the opportunity of the new age, of the new world we're in, is to make places which have been rendered unviable by the 20th century economy and by the Industrial Revolution, the great flow of people from the villages to the towns and cities. These villages that were left behind by our large-scale manufacturing are now going to become viable again, are becoming viable, and it's going to be possible to live and work and have a prosperous life in places that were last prosperous in the 18th century. Particularly in my area and sort of places I know, places that used to be centres of the wool trade and of food processing and farming. Not necessarily going to revive those, although local food processing I think could be an amazing British success story if we got that right. But there are opportunities now to make these villages viable economic centres once again. Partly because people are just going to be working from home, as we've all been doing for the last year and a half, and having their jobs, as it were, based in London or elsewhere, but effectively working from home and spending money in their local community. But it's also, I think, to be expected that we'll see companies setting up in villages and small towns, places like Devizes, which is a market town that was the centre of my constituency, which used to be a really thriving regional hub 200 years ago, and was then forgotten by the Industrial Revolution. Swindon became the centre. I think Devizes' time is coming again. I'm very excited by what the modern age is going to do to basically revive the old world, which is the world I like, and which we should all be seeking to recover. But as Martin's absolutely right, the key to that is effective broadband and mobile telephony and also transport. And I think there's huge opportunities to be done with an effective bus network, which doesn't have to look like great big buses following traditional routes. Networks of small, mini buses, AI enabled, on demand, wiggling through the villages according to where people actually want to get from and to, could be awesome. And then lastly, we'll see. The department is new. It's not totally clear what ministers are doing what yet. Where the brief, how the brief, what the responsible portfolios fall out in who's doing what. But I'm very hopeful that we will. Neil, particularly as Levelling Up Minister, will have the responsibility not just for the big economic infrastructure projects that we need to think about, but the stuff that will, and everyone Onward focuses on, which is the social fabric. You know, how are we going to create places that are livable and lovable, and that create gathering places for young people, older people, people from different backgrounds to gather and have agency together. And that was the great lesson of lockdown, was the willingness of people to come together and work as neighbours on behalf of the community. And we need to sustain that, and the way to sustain it is to create institutions, which is what Conservatives are all about. We're institution builders and preservers. And it is a fact of modern life that no government is to be blamed for, although it's happened under our watch and under Labour's watch in this century. I see Matt Leach here from Local Trust, who's sponsored a lot of the research into work with Onward, charting the decline of our institutions. And we need to be very deliberate, I think, and not just say it's market forces, it's people's choices. We have to be deliberate about building and supporting institutions like the post office, pubs, faith groups, community groups, youth clubs, and all the modern institutions that we can create to give people opportunities for connection and belonging and agency together. So I hope that is going to certainly what I'm going to be boring Neil and other ministers with. Please can we make that a priority for the levelling up agenda.
Danny, thank you so much. That was a brilliant way to end the panel, and entirely concur with all of your points about institution building, in particular those. It's a great Conservative tradition, potentially not given as much reverence perhaps in recent years as it perhaps might, but there is a real opportunity post-pandemic to start building, as you say. Fantastic. So we've got just over 25 minutes for questions. Can I open the floor? Yes. Gentleman at the back. I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions. Lots of questions. I'll take a couple at a time. So yourself and then
thank you very much.
Just the other side of the
Thank you very much. Yeah, good morning. Councillor Julian Gallant. I'm a councillor in Ealing, actually, which is probably an area that's right for levelling down rather than levelling up. But in the centre of Ealing, we have 2 big developments, which one is Dickens Yards, one Filmworks, and the developers there are absolutely crucial to the regeneration of that area, and especially the regeneration of retail and footfall. And footfall, of course, is only valuable if you've got a footfall everybody being there, and that becomes a community asset. So the question is really, you didn't really discuss developers, and I think developers are crucial in this whole business, and that's, as Conservatives, obviously, it has to be profitable, but the community is part of it, so perhaps a little bit more on that.
Thank you very much.
Hi there, Alban Stowe from the Prince's Trust. One of the really critical levers, and Danny and Neil both talked about volunteering and youth clubs and social institutions. One of the really important levers could be the UK Share Prosperity Fund. This idea that we replace the old funds, we lose some of the bureaucracy, and we help reach the people who need it most. My question would be, how would the Department for Levelling Up seek to drive that investment into some of those really critical local institutions?
I'm going to keep those 2 questions now because I think we've got enough time to bring everyone in. So, on those questions, who would like to jump in on developers and the UK Shared Prosperity Fund? Neil, can I ask you to?
Sure, yeah. So, to Julie's point, it's absolutely true. As part of the ABPG on loneliness, which I was involved in setting up, we've been thinking a lot about how you design in that sense of community and how you create sense of places that have that. There's a place that I think is fascinating in my constituency next to the railway station, Market Harbour, which was actually built to be kind of luxury flats, I think, but because of the financial crisis, things didn't work out that way. What ended up happening is it became housing for reasonably self-sufficient older people, and it's brilliant. And then there's enough space there. They sort of colonised it. They made their own kind of bar. They all look after each other because it's all the lifts and stuff. It's very friendly towards older people, and they basically form this community where they're all looking after each other. I think it's made me think a lot about the problem, and absolutely true. I mean, there's not enough. I should be careful what I say, Minister and so on, but there is not, I think, historically not been enough for the community coming out of development. The infrastructure levy that is coming will hopefully improve on Section 106, which I think had a lot of problems, and will enable us to do more for the community, create more community facilities around development, and that in itself will, I think, improve people's reaction to it, as well as making for better genuine placemaking around new developments rather than a little playground and that's the placemaking. And to Stone's point about the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, absolutely, it is there you did a brilliant encapsulation of what we're hoping for in a debureaucratised version of those social funds that used to get from the European Union that can indeed support all these things, and it will have quite a lot of current spending as well as capital, so that you're able to fund things that go on for a number of years. And I think it has got great potential to do exactly what you described.
Thank you very much, Neil. Martin, can I possibly bring you in on the developers point particularly? I was wondering if you had thoughts about SME developers potentially.
Yeah, I mean, the decline in SME builders and the development work that they did is absolutely stark. And I haven't heard enough so far about how they're going to get more involved in what we're going to do about levelling up. It seems to me that most of the debate has been about planning and how we're going to resolve it. And Neil, I don't envy you a job of trying to sort that drag of worms out, because that sounds awful. And there are so many conflicting pressures. But one thing's for sure, that it's going to be very important to try and engage the enthusiasm, the energy and the innovation of small builders and developers in this coming few years.
Thank you, Martin. I know Joe wants to come in. Danny, let me know if you'd like to come in on these questions, but Joe first.
Yeah, so I mean, a really interesting development plays a massive role in Stoke-on-Trent. We build 99% of our new build on brownfield sites. In terms of what I spoke about earlier about the reshaping of communities, the new developments in the city centre are creating a kind of new urban community. The challenge that we have, and this goes to the heart of levelling up, our industrial heritage means that we are either building on a mine shaft or a clay pit, and we have enormous problems, technical problems with building. So when we look at how we need to help communities to develop the sorts of sites that are really key to reshaping their communities, I think that's where the financial help needs to be. In terms of the Shared Prosperity Fund. I always go, it's the old European Union ESF stuff, which is not the Shared Prosperity Fund. I think is key. A lot of communities who got the old ESF go, well, we'll just get the Shared Prosperity Fund now, and I'm hoping that it won't just be a kind of cut and paste job, because we need to actually look at new things, new ways of doing things. And I know that it's really important that it's not a capital only, because the number of people that say to me, we want to invest in our social fabric, but it's people and it's capacity building. And I think that so far some of the levelling up has been focused on the shovel-ready projects and the capital investment. I know in Stoke we haven't had the capacity within our council to actually handle that, so I think that's a really important aspect.
Thank you, Joe. That is something that comes up time and again in our research, the need for revenue as well. Danny?
Well, just on August's point about UKSPF, I think he knows you're right, and there's a major opportunity here, and very, echo Neil's point that we want to improve on European funding. There was some value in the model, which basically was about long-term funding aimed, according to a formula which might not have been the best one, but at the places left behind, the regions of the country that had low productivity, etc., which got the money, and I think that principle is right. But whether how it's distributed, and crucially, my interest is in the role of the community itself in directing the use of that money. So I think the way to break through the bureaucracy is to empower places much more meaningfully. And then I think we will get what we've just been discussing, which is the focus on people and revenue funding, basically, in addition to new buildings. I think it's a massive opportunity. This is potentially the great Brexit dividend to get social funding to work in the way it should. It'll be a real challenge to ensure that we don't have too many losers. Politics of it might be challenging.
Thank you very much. So we've got, I know, a load of new questions. So we've got 15 minutes left. I'm going to take 3 questions. You, then second row, then front row, and then I hope, have time for 2 more.
So Ben Rich from the Radix think tank. I wanted to ask about mistakes. One of the biggest challenges, we did a report asking different MPs to write about what had happened in their constituencies during lockdown and how they captured community spirit. And what was very clear from that is that the social capital constituency by constituency is very, very different levels of voluntary sector organisation, very different levels of competence. For levelling up to work, it seems to me the Treasury and the government need to be much more tolerant of it going wrong. And that's a really, really difficult thing for government to do. How do you move to a position where people can make mistakes at the local level, because that's the only way that you will be able to invest in people rather than those centrally controlled shovel-ready projects Jay talks about.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, Helen Milner from Good Things Foundation. We're a digital inclusion charity. So 2 questions really. One is, I don't think we can level up without including the people who are digitally excluded, so 10 million adults in this country. We work with thousands of community organisations, small local charities, libraries, community hubs, and we empower and enable them. So I think it's really important to think about that social infrastructure, but we have economies of scale around resources and content, and also we're able to bring people together to share best practice, to talk about what hasn't happened, and to empower one another. So I'm worried about the rhetoric around levelling up, about 1,000 flowers blooming and it only being bottom up, because I think national leadership, national coordination, supporting with those economies of scale is also important, as well as empowering that local ownership.
Thank you very much, Helen. And Sundar.
Sundar Catwell from British Future. Yeah, I think Onward's done really well in putting this issue of social fabric and tangible aspect that has for identity and pride. We're thinking much more about levelling up than we were a decade ago when it was about the big society. So how do you deal with this challenge of the lack of capacity to engage in the areas with the least social capital? Does national government need to think more about that and do it in an ethos that's bottom up? What's the key to doing that?
Thank you very much. I'm going to be a bit more directive with my question, just to make sure I do get in the final couple of people who were wanting to ask. So there's this question about toleration of failure and tolerance of failure. Neil, could I ask, you've been a great advocate in the past for localism, effectively creating laboratories of change and innovation at a local level. How difficult is it politically to accept that risk of failure?
I think it's a really good question. So I think that there's sort of multiple elements to it. There's an element that is just about the kind of bureaucracy and the management and the accounting officer functions and all these things we talked about. EU funds having been quite bureaucratic. A lot of that was there to try and stop the money just disappearing. And the challenge there is really just to make sure it's not so heavy-handed that you are crushing the ability of small groups, SMEs, and genuine voluntary society to take part in these things by having too much accounting. The second bit is a bit more central to your point, which is, are you prepared for people to do experiments and them to not work out? And I think that is what we're trying to get to with a lot of the devolution and the kind of memo devolution agenda, which is you've got to have some accountability to go with things working out and not working out. Things won't always go right, and you have to, I think it's quite difficult to devolve without having someone you can ultimately kick out if things don't work out. I've been favourably impressed with some of the things that the mayoral combined authorities and mayors have achieved so far, but ultimately, not everything has gone perfectly, and there needs to be democratic accountability for me is the core of what will make experimentation work. There's other things too. There's how we learn from these things in the centre, with terrible history in the UK of what I call devolve and forget, and I don't just mean that for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but within programmes in England. And we are trying to learn from that. So things like the Towns Fund have a wrap around them where we bring people together who are involved in these projects across the country, and we try and have some central learning going on around it. Compare that to something like the Local Growth Fund before, where it was, even in the centre, it was quite difficult to find out what the money was even being spent on. So we are trying to kind of learn that lesson and have the benefits of experimentation, and also put in place an infrastructure for accountability about experiments, because not everything will always go right, and ultimately public one ultimately can.
Thank you. Can I now pose the question that Helen raised about digital exclusion? And I'd be really interested in your thoughts on this, Nick, and I might come to Martin as well on this as well, just because I think kind of you both represent networks of organisations which presumably do lots of work in this space, and could be leveraged to support many people who are currently excluded. So really interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely right. I think the exclusion agenda for us is twofold. Really, there's the essential banking element, there's also the digital element, and we think that both of these two are utterly critical for the levelling up agenda, and also for the change, the technological change that's happened so dramatically over the last 2 or 3 years, but also most specifically over the last 18 months. And I think that's something that we're very, very acutely conscious of. We talk a lot, certainly in business circles, about failing fast and failing quickly, and that's something certainly having come into a government role for the first time from the private sector. I've been quite intrigued by many of the civil servants, certainly in Bays, find this quite a difficult concept in terms of the notion of failing fast. We've been doing it in business circles for some time. Technological change has massively impacted our organisation, but also most organisations. And I think there's certainly for the private sector something the government needs to look at and observe. And we will certainly be within the post office making sure that we do two things. One, and it was touched on before, through the sort of bank hub concept, we absolutely think that the post office can be the centre of bank hubs in terms of making sure there is access to cash, making sure there's access to central banking, and want to play a role with the banks. And I think that's really important from our perspective. We've talked a lot about the decline in banks and the closure of banks, and we see a government asset in the post office that can play this role. Really, really important. But also from our perspective, we need to be more flexible as well, and so developing new formats that will help in new ways on the high street and also in rural communities is so important. So opening up in libraries, opening up in pubs, providing different services. To your point around digital, we see that as an opportunity for the post office and something that we can be much more flexible in terms of how we play that role too.
Thank you, Nick. Martin?
Yeah, it's interesting because when we did the pilot schemes as part of this Access to Cash program, there were quite a few quite whizzy technology solutions. And my instinct was, well, this sounds very innovative, this will go well. And the reality was they virtually all bombed, because what people wanted to do, a lot of people, is go into somewhere and look a human being in the eye and maybe ask them a question. And even when it came down to banking cash, right, there's this cold-hearted machine there that's you've got to put your bag of cash into. They didn't want to do that. They wanted to look somebody in the eye when they handed over the cash. They thought, I need to know that that person's seen me and I've seen them. And the human element in this is really important. The other example for me as well was making tax digital. You know, the government brought it out, and there's a sort of underlying assumption that everybody will welcome the idea that they don't have to produce these massive paper returns. Well, if I'm a business owner that's a little bit maybe of my vintage and doesn't quite like a lot of digital infrastructure, they react very angrily when they're forced down that track. They see it as a sort of libertarian response that, how dare you tell me how to do my tax return? And a lot of it is because their digital skills are weak. And they're not going to put their hand up and say, I'm digitally excluded. But they are going to react in a very aggressive and negative way. So I think it's a really important point that people have to take on board when designing these schemes.
Martin, thank you very much. I'm going to take a chance and hope that the last two questions will be of interest to Danny and Joe. So
That's the way.
so at the front and then at the back.
Thank you. My name's Toby Savage. I'm the leader of South Gloucestershire Council. We talked about a number of the opportunities for local government to help to empower some of the changes that we want to see. It's that balance between core funding that comes to councils versus the bidding opportunities into central government, how resource intensive those bidding opportunities are with no assurance that you'll be successful at the end of it, and it's just whether we've got that balance right between how the different funding streams work.
Thank you very much. Another back.
I'm Gareth Williams, Deputy Leader at Buckinghamshire. I was going to ask an identical question that's just been asked, funnily enough. But I'm just going to say, in terms of lessons from COVID, I think the hyper-local community network building that happened was predominantly in partnership with, anyway, local government to a great extent. And I've never seen a body so excited as when Danny's report came out, and so I'd be interested to know, is that stuck on a shelf somewhere? Are the volunteer passports going to come in? You know, and all the other social capital ideas that were in there. They were really energised by that. But are county deals going to be a way of delivering? I mean, all the things you talk about, telephony, about local infrastructure, about partnership. I would go so far as to say some of the big national charities were conspicuous in their absence during COVID in my county. And it was the real local organisations in partnership with local government that drove the change. And I think if it's a government delivery mechanism you're looking for, something like county deals have to be front and centre. So I'd just be interested in Hamill's thoughts on that.
Thank you very much. Jo, can I come to you first?
Yes, so I'm going to pull those two questions together because I think the answer is no. I don't think we've got the funding mechanisms right at the moment. Stoke City Council, I know, were massively challenged with the capacity to be able to submit the bids that we all wanted to happen. And I think that a better way might well be the sort of city deals, or we missed out on a town deal because we're a city but made up of 6 towns and it didn't matter. So the city has a vision, and the vision is a holistic programme which brings together all the various kind of community leaders and cultural leaders. But in order to achieve that vision, they're going to have to be piecemeal for lots and lots of different pots of money. That's both messy, time-consuming, takes away from the core functions that a local council has to deliver. And inevitably, I think, leads to them always working with the same people. So when we're talking about grassroots communities, an example, the Community Renewal Fund, I know that we only had a matter of weeks to put in bids, and therefore the very small organisations, the very small charities and social enterprises didn't really get included because there were 2 small individual projects. But I mean, this is where we actually need to empower and engage. So we need, my take on this is we need a community wealth chest, or a pot that actually sits probably not in the local council, but within the third sector groups, where the local council has a voice but doesn't have to go to the bidding and also the distribution of funds.
Thank you, Jo. Danny.
Very quickly, thanks. Loads there. So I totally sympathise and recognise the problem of the very expensive process of putting together funding bids to central government. And I hope that's going to improve. The opportunity is there to get it right. And I think UKSPF has a chance to do it, as well as we've been hearing about the Towns Fund being much more collaborative in the way it's designed and delivered. The downside of the approach that we have had is that councils particularly just have a series of projects they'd like to see funded, and they take off the shelf whenever a new project comes along and it doesn't quite fit, and isn't necessarily what community wants as well. I think someone mentioned county deals. I think that is an opportunity to get this right, because we need to thanks for the reference to my report, I talked there about collaborative commissioning rather than just everything being a competitive process, with a sort of black box, assessment. There needs to be an ongoing conversation over time about what a place needs and what government can contribute to that, but crucially, and obviously what the council is going to contribute, but crucially what other agencies and players in the area can contribute. And we need to, basically all the different assets need to be round the table saying how are we going to do this together, and then government can contribute it as part of that conversation. So just the point about the lack of capacity in places is relevant here. I mean, it's true that obviously we all know there are lots of places which have a sort of rather despairing culture locally. They don't think things are going to change for them. But I think there always are the people. There's no shortage of the people who can drive the change. What places like that lack is the institutions and sort of systems that those individuals can make change through, and that's where I think government does have a role. And always think of the New Schools Network. You know, if any of you were at the event last night that Michael Lowe spoke at, talking about this agenda, but you know, the example there, when he set up free schools, he also set up an arm's length, a non-governmental organisation, a new charity that had some government support, that basically went into places to talk to parents and teachers and local leaders about the opportunity of the new school, the free schools movement, and help them go through the process and bid for the money and set up their schools. So places that didn't have the institutional capital, but did have the people, government can play a role in ensuring that those systems are created. And so that's my point about being deliberate institution builders. So I hope as we do this new funding and levelling up support, we also think about the agencies that we can create or sponsor or back, watch them exist locally. And government can be doing about that.
Thank you very much. We are right on time, and I'm really grateful for all of our panelists for being so generous with their time as well. We've heard lots. I'm not going to try to summarise it all, but just a few things that I think came out really strongly. A real need to build capacity in certain places, and a role for government in doing that, both in house designing systems, but also kind of consciously, deliberately building capacity. A big focus on local institutions. A need to nurture trust as the basis for commercial exchange as well as social exchange. I was really struck by Nick's point about failing fast as well, and the need to actually be accepting of failure and getting failure out of the way in order to identify what's likely to be successful. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you in particular to the Post Office for supporting this session. And if you'll all just join me in giving a round of applause for our speakers. And